2014, Iraq was on the brink of collapse. The group that called themselves the Islamic State, or Daesh in Arabic, had swept across the country, seizing territory and shocking the world with their brutal capacity for violence. Media outlets and political pundits around the world predicted that Iraq would split into multiple states, unable to hold itself together as one nation in the face of the threat. It was against this backdrop that Haider Al-Abadi, an Iraqi politician, engineer, and former political exile under Saddam Hussein, became Prime Minister of a country in crisis. What happened next took the world by surprise. Over the course of the next 3 years, town by town, city by city, the Iraqi security forces, supported by the global coalition against Daesh, liberated the populations living under the brutal occupation of the so-called Islamic State and took back their country. The international community was shocked by Iraq's victory. World leaders and military strategists had predicted that it would take decades to defeat Daesh, and that Iraq, as it is known today, would no longer exist. In his new book, Impossible Victory: How Iraq Defeated ISIS, former Prime Minister Al-Abadi tells the story of how they did it, and why he believes his country and its people will continue to take the world by surprise. Prime Minister Al-Abadi, when you took office in 2014, Iraq was witnessing some of its darkest days. Daesh had shocked the world with its violence and brutality, and the Iraqi army seemed to be disintegrating in the face of the threat, which was moving closer and closer to Baghdad. What was the situation that you were met with the day you took office, and what were the very first challenges you faced as Prime Minister of a country at war?
Yes, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. The most crucial part was morals were very low. And you cannot find or fight an enemy with very low morals. So that was very important, to inject a lot of enthusiasm within the fighters and within, of course, the citizens at large, because you cannot isolate fighters from the citizens. They live there. So that was a crucial part of the campaign, and the tasks ahead of me, I know, is very tough. I know Daesh were very vicious and very frightening, and we have seen they didn't meet any resistance at all in the areas which they occupy. And the only thing that stopped them is they don't have enough fighters to advance. Otherwise, the whole areas collapsed. There was no resistance. People as if they were submitting, which really, it needs a lot of studies. You know, sometimes very vicious regimes and organizations can lead people to submit to what they are doing. People think probably they'll be best protected if they submit. I believe the opposite. If you submit it to them, it will be much worse later on. So I think this is a huge challenge was ahead of me. The other challenge, of course, which I discovered later on, very low resources. I mean, we have very few fighting forces. Most of our equipments were either damaged or taken over by Daesh. Huge areas were taken by the terrorists. We have millions and millions of people who become refugees, and you have to take care of them. You have to address their needs. It is huge. I mean, these are people who were not living in a tent. These are people, they are middle class, sometimes they are richer people. They were living in houses, and you have to accommodate them. You have to find a place for them. And of course, you have to be very careful as well that there is no infiltration by the terrorists in these communities, in the refugees. And the terrorists, they would do that to attack Baghdad internally or other governorates. But I think the reception of the people at large was very good at the time. But these are major tasks which I have to address at the time. So I think this was in my mind when I started. Of course, there was something which was not in my mind, the collapse of oil prices. It was very high in the summer, and all of a sudden, within a very short period, 2 to 3 months, it has collapsed to a record which we haven't seen for many years. That really was a huge challenge, which was not in our mind. And we thought that maybe a temporary thing is going to rise again, but it took us 3 years for the oil prices to rise up again. And that was a huge challenge, and it added to my, of course, burden to run the country.
There were many factors that created the conditions for Daesh's success, including, of course, Iraq's recent history of conflict, sectarianism, and instability, particularly since the US invasion and occupation. How do you understand the role of the United States in Iraq? And does America bear any responsibility for the rise of Daesh and the initial failure of the Iraqi army to fight back?
I don't think our American friends have really done a good job by training our own forces. There were a lot of gaps, a lot of dark areas which were unfulfilled. I think like logistic support were not there. My understanding was the US were thinking they would stay in Iraq for another 50 years or more. Don't forget, I mean, look at Japan, look at Germany, look at South Korea. They're still there. So they thought they will be still there for many years to come. And they didn't think that was a priority to give this logistical support to the Iraqi side. It was, their withdrawal was almost a sudden. And that withdrawal have left our forces not being trained enough or equipped enough to defend on their own.
In June 2014, Iraq's most senior religious figure, Grand Ayatollah Sayyid Ali as-Sistani, issued a call to arms, urging Iraqi citizens to volunteer to fight alongside the army in the war against Daesh. During a sermon in the holy city of Karbala, Ayatollah Sistani said, "Citizens who are able to bear arms and fight terrorists, defending their country and their people and their holy places, should volunteer and join the security forces to achieve this holy purpose." Prime Minister Al-Abadi, in your book, Impossible Victory, you give a lot of credit to the volunteers, the ordinary Iraqis who signed up to fight Daesh. What impact did that have on the military and the war effort?
The military was very important for us. Of course, we have the volunteers as well, which are very, very important factor in the achievement which we have made. And those have answered the call of Ayatollah Sistani. He called on Iraqis to defend their own country. And that has produced thousands and thousands of volunteers. They are prepared to die, prepared to defend their country, which really has produced a massive, massive moral boost for the people, for the military, for the commanders, and for the government as well.
There are many moments during the war that will be remembered around the world for years to come. The fall of Fallujah to Daesh, which harked back to the US occupation, the liberation of Mosul, which for many symbolized the end of the war and the end of Daesh. Yet there are other, perhaps somewhat surprising moments that you talk about in the book, which seem to stand out for you personally. And one of those is the battle for Jurf al-Sakhar, which you describe as a turning point in the war. What happened at Jurf al-Sakhar, and why was it such a pivotal moment?
See, Daesh has occupied the west of the country, and they occupied the country from northern Baghdad to Mosul. And they now started to threaten the southern of the country by cutting the roads between and connection between Baghdad and the south, which is Jurf al-Sakhar. Jurf al-Sakhar is a very harsh place, is agricultural place, very tough, a lot of green. The Americans had a very, very tough time when they were occupying Iraq in controlling this area. They did give a lot of casualties at the time because Al-Qaeda then was very active. Now Daesh is very active. So they managed almost to reach at the outskirts of Hilla, which is south of Baghdad. So it wasn't very clear what Daesh was aiming for. They wanted to link up from this end to the other end of Diyala. And Baghdad will be isolated from the north, from the south, and the south will be cut off from the country. Don't forget, this is the bulk of the country, where Baghdad and the southern areas represent the major economy of the country, and probably the most population, they reside there in this area. So it was disastrous if Daesh succeeded in doing this. Now we had to push them back. It wasn't a surprise as such, but what we have achieved, we have proven that Daesh are defeatable. Daesh are resistible, because before they thought nobody can resist Daesh, nobody can stand in their way. With minimal forces, we managed to kick them out, and many of them were killed, and many of them fled to Ramadi and to the western of the country and to Syria. And that was a huge victory. It also shows that cooperation between different fighting forces, the volunteers in particular and the army, each one was not trusting the other. The volunteers, they thought, since the army has given up fight, they surrendered, we cannot trust them. They will do the same. Even some were labeling commanders, and others were ex-Ba'athists. They were cooperating with the terrorists. So there is lost trust between the two. The army at the same time looking at the volunteers as not respecting them, not really obeying their own laws, their own customs. But I wanted the two to fight together for a simple reason. A, the army has the training, the heavy machinery, and they have the infrastructure. While the volunteers, they are very brave. They will sacrifice themselves for the sake of the country. They're very courageous in fighting. I mean, everybody has a fear in their own heart, but I think they have this ability to overcome this fear. I want the two to learn from each other. I want the army to learn this aggressiveness and this courage and bravery from the volunteers, and I want the volunteers to learn discipline from the army. So it was vital for them both. You cannot substitute one with the other. You need both. And in Jurf al-Sakhar, they worked together in a need. Each one needed the other. We have little army units in that area, but they have the heavy machinery and they have the helicopters. So they helped the volunteers in that regard, and the volunteers worked with them. And I've seen the first sign of the volunteers are loving the army, and the army is trusting the volunteers. So I think we have succeeded through my all emphasis on this, that everybody should trust each other, should work with each other. I think I succeeded in Jurf al-Sakhar in achieving this. And again, I succeeded in showing that Daesh is defeatable.
In your book, you talk about the war not just in military terms, but also in terms of the psychological battle that was playing out in Iraq, including the suspicion that existed between the military and the civilian populations they were trying to liberate. What did that look like, and how did you go about trying to change that mindset?
I've seen a lot of change in the behavior of my commanders. At the beginning, they would tell me, people are not with us. They hate us. They don't like us. I tell them, how did you know? So we go to their areas. The children threw stones on us. Loudspeaker in the mosques, they curse us. I said, well, look, it doesn't take much to motivate all of this by a few ideologically oriented terrorists. By encouraging these children to do this, they control the mosques or the organization of the mosque. And it takes probably 5 or 6 people to do all of this in terms of organization. Doesn't mean that the people dislike you. Yes, there is a lot of ignorance. I understand that. But you have to try to win over these people. And then we moved to Tikrit, which is very important. This is the birthplace of Saddam, and everybody expected us to uproot Tikrit. I mean, is like a vendetta. Especially, don't forget, in that area, in the first 3 days when Daesh rolled over in Iraq, they killed 1,800 cadets. These are very young people. They were not carrying arms. They were in their civilian clothes, and they took them and slaughtered them in cold blood. And so they thrown some in the river, and people collected their bodies in Baghdad and other southern areas. So it was a huge crime by Daesh, and of course you would expect people to have vendetta. against that area. But we managed to liberate the area with minimal damage. And within 2 to 3 weeks, the people who ran away from Tikrit to other areas in the north, in the KRG area, in Kurdistan area, we managed to bring them back very quickly. So I sent a message, well, look, this government is looking after you. We are for liberating you, not only liberating the land. We are defending you. This is contrary what Daesh was telling them.
You talk a lot about corruption in the book, both in terms of how it affected the war effort and also the disastrous effects of corruption on the development of the country. How did you approach tackling corruption during your term as Prime Minister?
I have to run by example, even myself. I have to be very good example to my commanders, to my fighters, and I have to be fair. You can give a lot of bonuses to this or that because they're close to you, but where is the justice? How others will perceive it? It's easy for a leader to be very nice to those who are close to him, those who approach him. But what about those who cannot approach him? Those who are in far areas? You cannot meet all the people. Not everyone can see you every day. It's not possible, of course. So I think justice is very important. From my experience, people can be very patient if you don't have enough resources, if their pay is not probably as they wish. But as far as they see that distribution of wealth is just and other people are treated in the same way as they are, I think they'll be very patient. Once they see that there's deviation from this and there's corruption and some people are being paid for no apparent reason, just because they are close to the commander, close to the leader, I think people will feel very, very angry because of the injustice.
During the war, you made a point of making regular visits to the front lines, which was a very dangerous thing for you to do. Why was this so important to you, and what impact were you trying to have?
It was very clear in my mind, I have to send a message that Daesh is not fighting. This is your commander-in-chief, he's in the front line. Don't be afraid of him. Anything can happen, I know that. I would take enough precautions, but if anything went wrong, it's beyond me then. I see in this my responsibility as commander-in-chief. These people are losing their lives, sacrificing their lives. Well, might as well I put myself in the same thing.
Over the course of Prime Minister Al-Abadi's term in office, city by city, the Iraqi army and the volunteer brigades that were fighting alongside them liberated the communities that had been occupied by Daesh, all but destroying the organization in Iraq and sending the fighters that remained fleeing across the border to Syria. But the end of the war brought with it another challenge for the country. The volunteer brigades, many of which were controlled by powerful political figures and foreign governments, had been empowered by the conflict and were unwilling to set down their arms. Many of these brigades, known as the Popular Mobilization Forces or the PMF, have morphed into armed militias answering to politicians behaving like warlords. Some are effectively controlled by foreign forces, including Iraq's neighbor, Iran. The question of what to do about the PMF has become one of the key challenges that subsequent Iraqi administrations have struggled with. So far, none has succeeded in bringing the PMF under the control of the state. You've said very openly that the Popular Mobilization Forces and the efforts of the volunteers were critical to winning the war. Yet the empowerment of the PMF as a result of the conflict has created many problems in Iraq during the years since, and the question of how to deal with this has become incredibly controversial. In your opinion, what needs to be done to bring the PMF under the control of the state?
Let us put a uniformity on the arms. It should be in the hand of the state only. Nobody should carry arms in the cities where it's highly populated or populated by the people. If you have arms, you bring it outside the cities, outskirts, away from the public. You shouldn't use these arms in the public, and you shouldn't use it in protecting your political entities. Leave that to the state, otherwise you'll not be on equal footing with other political parties in that regard. I think then we wait for 2 years, 3 years, until the whole threat of terrorism, the whole thing will die down. And we can integrate all these people within the state, either politically or militarily. I'm very much defender of those, but I'm not defender of warlords who are using all these resources and sacrifices to their own selfish end. These are completely incompatible things.
What does the country need now to move forward and thrive, and to be the country that the brave young people who have been out on the streets protesting deserve? What do you think needs to change in Iraqi politics?
Well, people look after their interests, and there's no shame on this. Everyone wants the success for himself. He wants to protect his own family, her own loved ones, and they will go a very long way to their extent to protect them and to do the best for them in terms of education, well-being. But the thing which is shameful, that you do it on the account of others, on account of the interests of the country. There should not be a collision between the two. It's not against each other. You should do it alongside it. And I think it's possible. Politicians must see their interest in the interest of the country. They can achieve well if the country is well, and they will lose out if the country is lost out.
Prime Minister Al-Abadi's family is one of many Iraqi families that bears the scars of Saddam Hussein's reign of terror. In 1980, his brother Ali, a 29-year-old university professor, was arrested, imprisoned, and tortured by the regime for being a member of the Islamic Da'wah party. A year later, they came for his other brother, Qaswar, and in 1982, a third brother, Ghalib, was also taken during his second year of medical school at just 20 years old. Ghalib was released after 10 years. The family didn't find out what happened to Ali and Qaswar until after the fall of Saddam in 2003. Both brothers have been killed. This book is a story of Iraq's recent history, but it's also your story. And it tells us a lot about Haider Al-Abadi, the Prime Minister, but we also hear some stories of your life before politics, including the cruelty and the trauma that your family endured under Saddam Hussein. How did these life experiences before you entered politics shape the leader that you became?
If you have loved ones with a family, especially if you suffer from oppression and dictatorship, people would be inclined to go into two paths. Either they will act like dictator in the future. People are subjected to torture. Sometimes they go along the same route. It's unfortunate, it happens. But what I learned is that you can only combat injustice and oppression by moving the other way, by fighting oppression, by fighting injustice. So since we've been subjected to this cruel behavior by the regime, it's not only me and my family, a lot of families in Iraq. That will give you enough dedication and enough force and motivation to be on the right path, to deliver at the end of the people, and not to be like the oppressor who oppressed you if you are in the same position as him. I was very careful. One of the things which kept me away from taking position number one in executive position in Iraq, which is the Prime Minister, is my fear that I lose myself. My fear is because of the need to fight this very vicious terrorist organization. You'll have to cut corners. You'll have to compromise your own belief. You have to cut the thing, find a quick route, with losing your own vision, on your own just theories and others. And it was tough. It was tough. It was very hard. And I think that is the most difficult part. It kept me in, oh my God, as if I was walking on a very tight rope. I shouldn't lean this way. If I'm very merciful and giving, and then the terrorists will run over the country. If I'm very harsh, then I'll become very unjust and another dictator, and I lose myself. I don't want to lose myself.
Before you returned to Iraq in 2003 and began your career in government, you were an engineer. You had a successful career in engineering in the UK, you had your own company and worked on projects with the BBC and the British government. How did your engineering background influence you as a politician and ultimately as Commander-in-Chief of a military at war?
The engineering. If you are a successful engineer, you know how to follow your things in terms of solving issues. There is a difference, of course. In engineering, you are working with dead material. Materials, they won't have feeling. They won't have response. But solving the problems, you see, with every engineering, there's management as well. They come together. Although I know professionals, they try to separate the human side of the engineering from the professional side of the engineering, but I never did that. So I did develop this idea. I did work in the 70s and beginning of 80s with AI, artificial intelligence. It was a very recent ideas, but I know the fundamental of it. The fundamental is that you provide information, you put in all your experience in solving problems, and you record it in a database so that you can get it out the moment you need. You don't have to go through the same process again. And that's what I have done in solving these problems. What you do is a common sense. People talk about common sense, about the sixth sense, which is very important in taking decision, because you have to control your fear. You have to control your uncertainty with others. You don't know how others will react in every action. But as long as you are doing it, A, with good faith, B, you have followed the proper and correct procedures, C, you have followed the laws which are there at that time, and you have followed the common sense in terms of what is right, what is wrong, there should be no fear. I've learned this. That's why others will be very much surprised once you see me very relaxed in a very tense moment. Very tense moment. I know in that tense moment it can go either way. I know. We can lose something or we can win. But since you have done it according to the rules, according to what you have brought up to do, according to your own, what you have learned from your own experience, and with your own self, and not compromising any of your principles, you should be very relaxed.
The final chapter of the book is titled Iraq Will Surprise You. Throughout the book, you can feel the optimism behind your words in many places, and especially in this last chapter. But the situation in Iraq today seems somewhat difficult to be optimistic about. We've seen repeated protests from the youth, demonstrators being killed by security services. What is it that makes you so optimistic about Iraq's future?
I visited many families, and I have to be prepared, because these families, they've lost loved ones, either a husband, son, a father, and I was expecting to hear harsh words. What have you done for us? Or something like that. But to be honest with you, I never hear that. On one occasion, I've seen a soldier who was fighting in Fallujah in Al-Kazmiya Educational Hospital, and he has his open surgery on his own stomach. He has problem in his own head. He hardly can move his head, arm, legs. Well, he was almost dying in that sense. And he asked me, he wants to say a few words, but he doesn't want the cameras. So we asked the cameras to move away. And I thought he would ask me something for his family, for himself. But he said, my friends in the front, our soldiers, the soldiers at the front, there is not enough logistical support getting to them. Some of the logistics getting very late. They need attention, please, sir. I ask you to pay attention to them and look what they need at the moment. I mean, that's very moving. I mean, that soldier who's almost there, he cannot move. And he asked me not for himself. He asked me for me a favor to look after his own comrades. I think this is very moving. And I've seen mothers who are saying they had two of their sons being killed in the front lines. And they said, if I can't give anything else, I would. It's very moving. I think we have a great nation here. That's why I say Iraq will surprise you.
Prime Minister Al-Abadi's optimism and hope for his country are clear throughout the book. At a time when politics seems to be failing the Iraqi people and the future of the country remains insecure, this optimism is needed today more than ever.